When I finally opened my eyes the next morning, I immediately knew I'd slept for a long time. The normally dark room was filled with ambient light seeping under the door, so much that I could plainly see I was alone in bed. But I hadn't had any nightmares, and she still had access to my biosig and would have known if I had. In fact, she probably knew I was waking up right now. Treating my body to the rest it so desperately craved filled me with euphoria. I smiled and began to stretch. The sudden tightness in my wrist wrenched everything back into a cold perspective. It was very likely I was only alive because of V. Yes, I had left the water running instead of turning it off so I wouldn't alert her. And yes, I had chosen a razor meant for shaving my legs instead of pocketing a knife from the kitchen when she wasn't looking. I knew what that was all about. But would I have held out as long as I did if not for her? The strings she had pulled after my OD had probably kept me out of the morgue. And if she had reacted differently when she caught me with that pregnancy test, why hadn't I simply locked the door and let me push her away? I didn't want to think about what might have happened. This was a new day. I had no clue what it would bring, but for the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel that horrible sense of dread creeping over me. Rubbing away the grains of sand that had formed in the corners of my eyes, I carefully rose from the bed and chugged the water V had left for me the night before. An odd yet familiar sound drew my attention toward the door. I froze, listening intently. My heart sank when I heard it again, louder this time. V was crying. She had to be mentally exhausted after everything I had put her through. I didn't doubt she'd laid next to me all night long, struggling to keep her eyes open, browsing her hollow and occasionally checking to make sure my pulse remained steady. To put all of that on her shoulders and expect her to remain strong simply wasn't reasonable. And the last thing I wanted was for V to put on some act when I unloaded all my baggage, only for her to then cry it out when she didn't think I was looking. I opened the door and winced as my pupils contracted from the sudden onslaught of daylight. When they had adjusted, I glanced around and spotted V on the couch, with my wreath on her head, and the virtue still slotted. Oh no. Her cheeks were a bright shade of red and were soaked with tears. Another sob escaped between her ragged gasps as she trembled on the cushion. Shit! How long had she been watching it? I closed the distance between us as fast as I could and tore the wreath off of her. She would be discombobulated and feel like shit from having been wrenched out of it without warning, but I couldn't let her watch it. She would know everything they had done to me, everything I had done, and what I had been thinking about when it happened. V! Appearing dazed, she blinked, her eyes slowly drifting toward me. Her chin trembled, and in that instant, I knew I was too late. She knew. Judy, Who? I covered my face in shame. Any chance I'd had of trying to walk V through things the way I needed to, why I had reacted the way I had, everything with Cindy, had been ripped away from me. The last pieces of the puzzle had been dumped into her lap, and the picture they formed was a fucking mess. And I had no one to blame but myself. Years had gone by, and there'd been nothing stopping me from telling her except the terror of this moment. V tried to reach out to me, but I pulled away, still refusing to look at her. Didn't want you watching that, I spat, though I was angry at myself, not V. I understand why. Christ, Judy, I had no idea. But why were you watching it? I shouted. Why didn't you just fucking burn that thing as soon as you saw it? Why didn't you just tell her, you gonk? Could have saved yourself all of this trouble if you would have opened up to her years ago. Were you really that afraid? Judy, V sat up and wiped the wetness from her face. You said they mentioned my name. that they did this as some sick way of getting back at us for taking down their ring. I wanted to look for clues to try to... To what? I waved my hands in the air. What were you gonna do? Find some clue and run out there, hoping to gun them all down before they grab you and do the exact same fucking thing? V looked away, though I could tell from the tightness in her jaw that I wasn't far off the mark. She wanted vengeance, and I couldn't blame her for that, but she'd only found the truth instead. Sit down, V said quietly. Please. I breathed an uneasy sigh and did as V asked, already suspecting where the conversation was going. Where it had to go. Let me explain. I tried to look for something in the environment, some clue they might have left behind like they did last time, V explained. But I couldn't. It was too horrible. And there was more going on that I didn't expect. A long silence dragged on between us. I knew what she meant, and that she was opening the door for me. As painful as it would be, I didn't see any other way to go but forward. So now you know, I said finally. You know just how sick and fucked up I really am. That it wasn't just what they did to me, but what she did that made me like this. Jude, please don't say you're made any certain way. And you mentioned her once before. I did? I was genuinely confused. When had I ever mentioned Cindy to her? V nodded. Back at Laguna Bend, when we were diving. Who is she? And please tell me the truth this time. It was pretty obvious before that she was a lot more than just some childhood choom of yours. And your thoughts about her, the way you felt, it was plastered all over that XBD. Jesus. I shook my head. I want a drink. Can't. You know the place is dry. Don't care. Want one anyway, I said petulantly. Jesus, I could almost taste the vodka in my mouth, feel my sinuses being forced open. I knew dropping the bottle had been for the best, but still. Fuck! I took a long, deep breath, bracing myself for what I was about to say. The beginning? Let's start there and see where it takes us. The beginning. I'd make such a stink out of it, trying to convince myself I didn't know when things had started to go bad. That had been just another lie, though, one I'd told myself countless times so I wouldn't have to face my past. Like a bookmark, it was easy to flip back through my memories once I started to try. V looked at me expectantly, her hands folded in her lap. She said she wanted this. I couldn't deprive her of it anymore. Well, guess you could say it all started when I was little. I stopped to study V's reaction. She was nodding along, clearly not having a clue where I was going with all of this, but still willing to listen. It wasn't all that much different from most kids back then. A little poorer and rougher around the edges, but we got by all right. Of course, that didn't matter. They all saw me as nothing more than some piece of trash with a weird last name who talked funny. You heard a little bit of it the first time we went diving there, remember? Yeah, V replied, pursing her lips thoughtfully. I heard their voices in your memories when we were scrolling. The way the other kids used to make fun of you. It was pretty fucking mean of them to tease you like that. I don't know, I shrugged casually. Kids will be kids no matter where you live. Don't even think they knew they were being mean half the time. And they certainly weren't thinking how it would make me or anyone else feel. It's what kids do, and I dealt with it. Got in a fist fight with Tommy Chase for swiping my lunch at school. Spent a few days locked in the house when I slapped Janet Meininger? Shit, I can't remember her last name. Doesn't matter. Point is, I hated them. But I didn't mind playing by myself. For a while, at least. V shifted so she could face me better, her brow narrowing. In a strange and somewhat humorous way, she reminded me of a child setting in for a long story, which, in fact, she was. It got worse? I shook my head. No, we just got older. The other kids stopped playing street hockey and started stealing smokes. A couple of them who lived near the end of town, a brother and sister, started swiping booze out from under their parents' noses and bringing it to school, drinking it during recess. I kept my distance from them, playing with some of the younger kids, but it wasn't as much fun. I was surprised how much that silly admission stung. I wasn't a kid anymore. I hadn't been in ages, so it shouldn't have bothered me to say I was picked on and to simply deal with it. Hell, there were thousands of kids in Night City who had it far worse than I'd had. But still, they had been so mean to me, and I had done nothing wrong to them. If they hadn't wanted to play, I could have dealt with that. But to laugh and make fun of me... That's understandable, V said. And fuck those other kids for not seeing how awesome you were. But I bet those little tykes you played around with must have thought you were the coolest kid ever. The small smile that had spread across V's face quickly faded when she saw me frown. She had no idea how ironic she was being. I'm sure they did. It's not hard to look up to someone who's older and want to be like them. Which, shit, brings me round to Sydney. Her name might have slipped out once before when I hadn't been thinking about it, but it was bizarre to speak it so openly. I felt like I was a child again, muttering a curse word under my breath and hoping my abuelo didn't overhear me. V still seemed calm and interested, though I knew there had to be much more going on behind those blue eyes of hers than she was letting on. Go on. I took a deep breath. I was probably 12 or some shit when I met her. They lived right across the street. Think I even pointed it out to you the last time we were there. Her parents kept to themselves, though, and no one really saw much of her. Guess she was kinda like me in a way, keeping to herself. Then one day, out of the blue, I was throwing some rocks to kill time when she walked up to me and said hi. I was having a hard time making sense of it all, V said, briefly glancing at the XBD, her lips quickly curling in disgust. How you felt about her, I mean. And you think I didn't? I chuckled. I was 12. She was 16. Had cool clothes, always wearing makeup and lipstick. Shit, V, she even had her own car. But more than all of that, she played with me. She'd swing by our place and have dinner with us, and then play in my room with all of my dolls and stupid shit. Even started inviting me over to her place sometimes when her dad wasn't home. Not that she had any toys or anything, but it felt so good to finally have a cool choom. V smiled. It was sweet of her to do that. Guess I can kinda see why you might have had a crush on her. Maybe she was lonely like... Sweet. V, use your head. What 16-year-old with a fucking car who could go anywhere she wanted would choose to hang out with a little kid like me? She was trying to work it out, obviously sensing she wasn't going to like what I was beginning to allude to. What do you think she was getting out of it? I pressed. Judy, I don't know. I'm sorry, I can't... No. I raised my hand, quickly cutting her off. You wanted me to tell you, and I put this off for far too long. This shit's been locked up inside of me since long before I met you, and now I don't know how to stop. So let me get this out, all right? V swallowed nervously and nodded. I paused to glance out the window, trying to slow the thoughts that were racing in my head. It was important to say this the right way, but I couldn't think of how to tell her. What were the right words? Were there any? Didn't know it at the time. Shit, how the hell could I? But her dad was molesting her. Had probably been doing it since she'd been little. And the guy had some shady connections. Remember I told you she was always wearing lipstick? Yeah. Matte pink. Perfect for a cover-up. And you know better than most, the kind who wear that on the streets. V's eyes widened. Are you saying that fucker was getting her high on lace? His own daughter? Yeah, I nodded. My face was burning again, and tears stung my eyes. But I steeled myself, digging my cuticles into the flesh of my palms until they had nearly broken the skin. I had to tell her. I didn't know, V. I was only 12, still playing with stupid toys. How the fuck was I supposed to know what she was really after? There it was. The realization of what I was saying had finally hit V like a sledgehammer. She didn't crumble apart and burst into tears like I feared she might, but she couldn't mask the shock and hurt she felt. Oh, fuck. Judy. I didn't know. I remember you saying that not all your memories were happy ones, but no one, certainly not a kid. Fuck, I'm so sorry she did that to you. I wanted to cry, but not because of the memories playing out inside of my head, which were still so fresh they seemed to have happened only yesterday. Not because Cindy's voice rang so clearly in my ears I would have sworn she was standing right next to me. It was because I had been wrong. All this time, I'd carried this baggage around thinking V couldn't take it, that anyone could, or that maybe she could take it but would never understand. But there she was, sitting across from me with my ugliest secrets finally having been dumped on her. And still, I saw love in her eyes. Why did I deserve that? After everything I had done. She knew what she was doing, too. I rubbed my eyes. First thing she got me hooked on was herself. Being her chum was the first drug. Then she passed me an inhaler one day when her dad wasn't home. She made you puff that shit? V asked, her eyes nearly bulging from their sockets. As a kid? Why was she so surprised? It wasn't anything she didn't stumble across every day on the streets. I think she thought that's how it was supposed to be. First, you get someone fucked up, and then you actually get to fuck them. It was certainly happening to her, and that's what she did to me. Went on like that for years. But how? No one saw this or said anything? Your grandparents, they had to have known what was going on, right? No, I shook my head sadly. Not for a long time, anyway. I'm sure they thought it was weird at first, how much time I was spending with her and all that, but they were just glad to see me hanging around with someone for a change. V sat up, trying to shake some sense into her head. She was fidgeting with her hands, which had turned sweaty. This was either much more or much worse than she had expected. Perhaps both. But what about everyone else in town? No offense, but Laguna Bend wasn't that big. I laughed, which only seemed to magnify the concern in V's eyes. Cindy knew all the tricks to hide what we were up to. She taught me about putting on the lipstick. That was one of her first lessons. And of course, my abuelos just thought I was trying to be like her, washing up and chewing gum after eating her out so I wouldn't stink of her when I went home, coming up with games we could play at night so no one would grow suspicious when my door was closed. Like I said, she knew what she was doing. How long? It was a simple question, but arguably the hardest one she had asked so far. It was hard to answer, too, considering so much of that period of my life had blurred together. 4 or 5 years. By the time people started putting 2 and 2 together, Laguna Bend had been flooded and we'd moved to this apartment. I didn't spend much time here, though. Was angry at my abuelos, blaming them for losing our place and having to move to this nasty roach motel. And then Cindy asked me to help her get a place of her own. And that's where I started spending most of my time. V stood and walked into the kitchen, rubbing her chin and seemingly lost in thought. I was tempted to head off the next question I could already see forming behind her eyes, but I stayed quiet. As much as I needed to tell her, she also needed to absorb all of this in a way she could handle. What do you mean, she asked you to help her get a place. Weren't you still a kid? Bingo. Yeah, I was. And how valuable do you think something like that is to all the twisted fucks out there? Hell, you've seen plenty of it, V. Eddie's can only buy so much, and when she didn't have those, I wound up becoming her currency. She'd trade me for whatever she needed, and I think she got off on it too, 'cause it's what her dad had done to her. V suddenly threw her head into the sink and retched, the harsh gurgling from her throat echoing off the walls. My guilt grew with every heave before she finally sucked breath into her lungs. When she emerged and wiped her chin clean with a nearby towel, her face had turned a frightening shade of white. You were right. I need a drink. Yeah, I agreed. But like you said, the house is dry. V poured herself a glass of water instead and took a few careful sips before stumbling back to the couch. Her legs nearly gave out and she collapsed onto the cushion next to me, spilling some drops on her lap. She offered the water to me, but I refused. The world hadn't ended like I feared it would. I was still here, and so was V. We were beaten to shit, no doubt, but we'd managed to make it this far. Could we go further, or would the taut line that connected us finally snap? I'm sorry if I'm asking too many questions about all of this, V said, suddenly sounding exhausted. I think it's important to talk about it, though. It's okay. But do you get it now, V? Why I felt the way I did during the whole fucking ordeal? Why I didn't want you to know? Please understand. Please. V nodded and took a big gulp from her glass before setting it down and looking at me. I get it, Jude. And I hope you believe me when I say I could never blame you for how you... Fuck, I guess we're gonna have to say it at some point, so I might as well just say it. How you enjoyed parts of it. But you were all fucked up on... Was that ice? Felt familiar. Enjoyed. No matter how gently she spoke that word, it wouldn't have cooled my cheeks, which had turned flush with heat. With shame. Fuck, I could finally admit that to myself. I'd been ashamed for so long. Yeah, I sniveled. They kept dropping tabs on my tongue. No clue how many. And of course, my fucked up brain... Stop saying you're fucked up, V said sternly. I know you, Judy. No matter what you've locked away all this time, I know you. I don't believe you would have ever done something like this willingly or enjoyed it even the slightest fucking bit if those sick bastards hadn't done that to you. V let out a tired sigh and looked back at the wreath. The sensors still flaked with images of my rape. I wish I could have helped you. My heart ached at the guilt in her voice. I didn't want her blaming herself or thinking there was something she could have done to stop it. V looked back at me. But I also get why you didn't want me to know, either. I suspected things, but not all of this. Not that you were abused as a kid by some pedo, forced to get high, groomed to like it that way, but... Her voice trailed off as she noticed just how red my face was, how I could no longer meet her gaze. I didn't know how to act around her anymore. The old Judy she'd known and fallen in love with had disappeared, replaced by the new one who suddenly seemed a stranger. Or was it the other way around? Which was which? She shifted closer, closing the distance. You got nothing to feel ashamed about, Judy. You never did. But I did. Hadn't she heard a single word I'd said? Didn't she see the fucking pattern right in front of her? I appreciate you saying that, but I shouldn't be the only one being honest here. Of course I got shit to feel ashamed about. Once I finally got clear of her, once I met you, I had a choice every single day to tell you all of this, V. And I didn't just lie about it, I justified it. Told myself you were too weak to handle it or that you wouldn't understand. Then it was the beauties and how I had to protect you so you wouldn't fall off the wagon. And then it was just because I was okay and getting better, so why fuck all that up? Don't you see? I always find a way to make it good in my head, to twist things around so they're pointing at someone else, to find some way to take advantage of it. That's what she did to me. That's what I hate her for the most. Turning me into a monster, just like her. I was wiping fresh tears from my eyes by the time I finally stopped. It was all out in the open now, and at last, V knew who she was with. The monster. V slowly reached out, her hand stopping inches from my shoulder. Is this okay? Don't need to ask me every time you want to touch me, V. No, but I want to respect your boundaries right now. And it's understandable if you need some stronger ones for a while. So I'm going to ask again. Is this okay? I nodded. The dry warmth of her touch that I expected to feel was replaced by a clammy iciness that sent a shiver up my spine. You're not a monster. V squeezed my shoulder, then chuckled to herself. I think I remember you saying something like that to me not all that long ago. And I'm glad to hear you say that you chose to lie to me every day. What? Why? V shrugged. Because you had a choice just now. You could have put the walls up and closed me out like you did before and not told me a single thing. But you didn't. You chose to tell me all of this. It sounds to me like that's something you didn't have much of for a long time. Choice. Yeah, it really fucking hurts to hear that you knowingly lied to me every day since we first met. Almost as much as it hurts that you didn't feel like I would understand. But you chose me today. And I'm happy you did. There was silence between us. Even though I'd just woken up, I still wanted to crawl right back into bed and hide under the covers to shut out the world around me. There's more, V. I know there is, baby. But this is already a shitload to take in, for the both of us. But I'm ready to listen to you when you're ready to tell me more. It doesn't have to all be right now, Judy. I'll still be here. You can believe that. I don't know why I felt so nervous. V was giving me more time, and honestly, it felt like the right thing for both of us. But there was something else she had wanted to say and had stopped herself at the last moment. Why? Can I have a little more time? I asked, already knowing V had given it to me. Haven't talked about this since, well, ever. With anyone. Feels weird. V raised an eyebrow, a hint of smile tugging at her lips. Weird in a good way or in a bad way? Just weird. Like, all of this happened to someone else, and I'm only remembering now that it was me all along. Does that make any sense? It does, V agreed. V's hand worked its way along my arm toward my wrist. I allowed her to lift it into the air so she could inspect the wrapping she'd applied the night before. A notification appeared on my HUD, informing me she had ceased her monitoring. How's this feeling? It's all right. I stretched my arm out, carefully twisting my wrist to get a feel of it. There was a small stab of pain, but not enough to make me wince. Can't wait for the itching to start. She nodded, though her eyes wandered back to the wreath. It was still on the table, almost like it was waiting for us, taunting us.
Fuck you both soon.
Was that another way they had marked me? To leave me in fear for the rest of my life, always looking over my shoulder, wondering if they might creep out of the shadows and grab me again? Repeat the whole fucking thing? V had to feel horrible, being used as the scapegoat for why they'd done it. If the roles had been reversed, I couldn't even imagine the heartbreak I would feel. I knew she was hurting, and I spotted a flicker of pain in her eyes before they narrowed into the familiar sharp points I'd seen many times before. She reached over and snatched the wreath off of the table. I'm gonna go through some of my old shit today and pick out a few things I can take to the pawn store. should be able to scrape enough together to get us through the next month. Back to the Eddies. V had barely worked any gigs since I'd OD'd, and now I wasn't going to be pulling in any scratch at all. I hadn't given the matter a second thought when I'd pressed the blade into my wrist. What would happen to her? And it was a problem we needed to figure out soon. But I couldn't focus on that now. Instead, I was more concerned with how white her knuckles were turning, how focused her voice had been. I knew she was turning toward the one thing that had always worked for her. Rage. I put my hand on top of hers. Don't do this, V. But it was too late to prevent the meltdown that had been quietly building up inside of her. I have to. It's the only fucking way I'm gonna get any justice for you. V stood up and began tinkering with my wreath. Shit, how do you turn off the goddamn sensory output on this thing? Justice? What justice did she think she would find for me out there? I knew she wasn't that deluded. You asked me to let you in, and I did, V, I said, rising from the couch. Now you gotta do the same. What are you talking about? Talking about what's really going on here. With an angry huff, V stopped what she was doing and turned toward the window. Her silence said more than any words could. I held out my hand. Give it to me. Judy, I'm not gonna have you running around out there shedding blood 'cause of me, or worse yet, having something happening to you. Give it to me. I felt terrible for being so demanding right after I dumped all my shit on her, and I could sympathize with the struggle she was going through. If there was even the slightest chance of getting justice, I might have even considered letting her go. But killing wasn't going to solve a damn thing. Everything they had done to me would still remain. It was over, and I had learned the hard way that there was no going back. A thought occurred to me. It would be a token gesture, but if it would help, why don't I call your Choom River and spill the deets to him, alright? And don't tell me about how crooked the badges are and how they won't do shit. You said it yourself. He was one of the good ones. Former good ones, V corrected. Guy's not on the force anymore. But I bet he's still got connections. I'm sure he'll look into it, unless you think he won't for some reason. V rolled her eyes, but I could see defeat slowly settling in as her muscles relaxed. A wave of relief washed over me when she acquiesced and set the wreath in my hand. I knew she wanted to say that nothing would come from it, and she was probably right, but it was still better than staying silent. It was awkward talking to River. The guy seemed as friendly and good-natured as he'd been when I'd listened in on his conversation with V back in the hospital, but describing the events that had taken place, along with all the grisly details, had still been an unsettling experience. But he listened politely, speaking very matter-of-factly, only asking the questions he needed to. He promised he would look into it, and I appreciated his honesty when he admitted there was a good chance nothing would come from it. It had been nearly 2 months, and the badges would be so busy trying to deal with the latest horrors Night City had served up to them that there wouldn't be much they could do, but it was the best I could hope for. I felt different when I hung up. Lighter, as if I had cut something loose. V was taking a shower, though I could tell from the way she was washing herself that she was hurrying up, probably worried I might try to do something to myself again. It was understandable, but I couldn't envision trying to hurt myself again. It had been the single biggest mistake I had ever made in my life, and as painful as all of this was, it was still better than the void I had nearly thrown myself into. I glanced at my wreath on the kitchen counter. Sure enough, V had messed up the settings, and I would need to spend some time readjusting them. But time was one thing I now had in abundance. I ejected the shard and examined it. Flat gray, no labeling, the usual connector pins at one end that were common in most BD formats. Nothing about it hinted at the brutal acts contained within. With the flick of my wrist, I tossed it into the trash. It was a symbolic gesture, but at least now there was one less copy of me floating around the streets. It was progress.